obviously, we're having this conversation virtually, but in the work that you do, are you able to weight perhaps the effectiveness of, coaching virtually versus face to face in the same room?
Yeah, I think you, um, I talk about kind of the learning process and like the iteration process. And when you're face to face with someone and you can sit down with them and go and have lunch or go back into the classroom and then go out and deliver another session on the pitch, you get to see it and you get to work really in rapid iterations. The virtual stuff, I don't think you get that.
Sure.
Um, but it's they're kind of different. Uh, they're different in that sense as well. I think in that the having a conversation with someone and work on the overarching philosophy, uh, how you're thinking about things, lessons that you've learned, the coach's reflections, like what do you think about my reflections, and so they tend to have different functions. I think. Um, in that you tend to talk about the kind of higher philosophy stuff, and then when you're with someone you're really in the weeds with them about like were these cones far enough apart, and did I see that situation correctly.
Are you so? For example, when you're going over to England, this most recent trip, I mean, you talk about are the cones far apart? Are you paying attention to? Um, I would maybe categorize that as how the learning environment is set up, or are you solely focused on the language of the coach, the body language of the coach? What's sort of in your lens?
All of it. I like my interest is in the head coaching position and everything that comes with that, and so I kind of conceptualize it as being a single cell organism, so you can't actually pull it apart and make it into these various. But we like to do that because it's easier to study or it's easier to teach that way, or say we're going to do this thing. But what ends up happening is, and the Premier League workshops are great at this. Is you can look at a problem or a reflection or something didn't land on the field, but then you can actually go with the coach and take it back, and it might have been something in their planning, or might have been something in their conceptualization, or might have been something in their language. It's way further back down here, that actually turns out to be why it ended up that way. And so that's what I mean. You can't really pass it all apart and just say, like, I'm looking at their communication. It's got to be more complex than that, because often it's not just that.
So when you talk about the reflections, so I get asked a lot, what are some of the commonalities or observations that I make of the coaches that we work with at the coaches site? And one of them that has really stood out is that the professional coaches, almost to a person, all journal, or they have a means of keeping track of things they observe. It might be a lot of coaches keep track of all their game cards. Some have all the notes and all their pregame speeches, and they actively go back and look at it, which I'm assuming is part of what when you refer to coaches going through a reflective process. How would you coach a coach on how to reflect on, as you said, maybe go back and identify where some of the gaps were that led to something not showing up on the pitch, the field, the court?
Yeah. I mean, if you think that coaches haven't been reflecting, for generations, you don't understand sport or coaching. If you think this is some sort of new thing, you've never been a head coach. Like, we have this thing called the drive home. And
Yeah.
if you've been a head coach, I don't even need to explain it to you. You know exactly what I'm talking about. And so, yeah, you're right. There's always been a reflective practice. There has to be. You've got to go and deliver a session tomorrow, or you've got a game tomorrow, or you just want to analyze your performance and wonder what you could do better. And when you're standing up there in front of 23 young hockey players and they're looking to you for what to do next, and you can see the looks in their eyes. You know if your message has landed or not. And so,
100%. Yeah.
again, there's this, because it's kind of this, we make this mistake of thinking that because reflective practice has kind of been a hot button topic over the last couple of years, that it's somehow new to coaches, and it's just not true. But I think where the coach of coaches comes in is now there's an accountability partner within that reflective practice that there hasn't really been in the past. And there's someone that can guide their awareness through that reflection. And it's often, for me, less about what you described there, Aaron, and more about where you're headed. So I'm more goal oriented with coaches, really looking at their strengths and what's going to get them and keep them at the top level. And when they're drifting away from that, that'll show up in their reflective practice as well. And so I can be the person to kind of say, okay, well, you made a mistake here. That's fine. But it's also not you, and that's not fine. That's not acceptable. We need you to be you. So if you're yourself and you're heading towards your goals and you're making mistakes, we can live with that. But where you've been dragged away or made a decision that you felt wrong in your gut, but you made it anyway, let's drill down on those kind of things rather than no coach wants some sort of checklist person. You did this right, you did this wrong.
Yeah.
No one in the world wants that to happen to them. Certainly not head coaches. They get enough of that in the general public. And so, it's less fix what you've done wrong, more let's head towards what you're working towards and who you're trying to be as you work towards that.
When I reflect back on my own, we'll call it a coaching degree or coaching career, which has been, coached at the university level, junior level, minor hockey. There's been some seasons where I look back and I say I was very consistent. As you said, the coach that I aspire to be, or that person I aspire to be in front of the players, that I was able to maintain that over the duration of a season. There's been other years where I was like, gosh, I look back and I'm like, I couldn't keep it on the tracks. And I'd have my own theories of perhaps why that is. What would you point out as some of the challenges with coaches maintaining a level of consistency or being able to show up the way that they aspire to show up on a daily basis?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I think we need to acknowledge how difficult that is just in general life. It's not a hockey coach or a football coach problem. That's all of us are aspiring to do that, for our kids or our partners or our mothers or whoever we're trying to show up for and aspire to be. And so, first of all, is to acknowledge that, I think. Second of all, there's all sorts of conceptualizations that I would suggest we get wrong. One being our idea of competition and winning, which is skewed, and you see it every day on social media, people talking about if you do these things, you win or you're more likely to win or, great. Yeah. You see, and they're very popular, and that's the problem with them is, championship teams do this and, great teams do this and bad teams do this. None of those things are actually true. I can point to examples of plenty of teams that have won championships that have done the things that they say the bad teams do. And so really, I think our conceptualization, particularly of competition and winning, is interesting to play around with. And why I say that is that the number one reason why teams lose games is that someone has to.
Yeah.
And the opposition are training as much as us. They're coached probably as well as us. They probably have a lot of talented players as well. And, there's all sorts of equalization measures that have now flown back from the professional world into, minor hockey, and you've got drafts and things like this. And so the talent distribution is even. And so these old kind of ideas of if I just do all these things and show up and compete, I'm going to win, it's not true. And so I think that's a good starting point of really looking at how we conceptualize the endeavor that we're actually in, which is competition, and are we thinking about that in the right way? And when we start to look at it as the opposition are also really, really good, we can start to maybe smooth some of those waves of the ups and downs and getting down on ourselves about a particular loss. And by virtue of that, the coach maybe doesn't take it as hard, a particular loss against, a team that they're supposed to beat down on, or whatever the narrative is.
Yeah.
And just I think that's a good starting point, and you can start to unpack a lot of things off the back of that one idea around how are we thinking about competition. And let's be really honest, like the level of competition in the elite levels of sport is off the charts. The teams down the bottom they're not getting beaten
Oh,
down
man.
like
Yeah.
they used to. There's really good teams that are still struggling, but they're still really good.
Yeah. No, it's and I think we're starting to see that at all levels of sport, probably because there's just more information's available, there's more coaching, but you talk about how to unpack a loss. Like, obviously I would say that, our audience um, may not all be professional coaches, but I could see where this is probably where, as you said, I think what you just described there, where you lose a game that the narrative is you're not supposed to lose, not being able to rebound or manage that, isolated case effectively, I sense can derail a lot of seasons, or can turn what was maybe, coach might have been on a great track, and that one little event could take them off that track very easily.
Very much so. Yeah.
So how would you recommend to coaches to frame or think about a loss that maybe they also perceive as being, one that shouldn't occur?
Yeah. Well, I think it comes back to, they're going to respond how you respond. So the idea that I work off is, and I've written about this for quite a long time now, is teams become their leader. And, this is proven many times over. It's proven in different domains, certainly in sport. And so, basically how you want them to respond becomes how you respond to it. And so if you're optimistic off the back of, a so-called bad loss or a run of losing, and you're still pushing them towards, making sure that they are still striving for their talent, they're dedicated to their craft, they're putting in the effort at training, all the things that we think line up to being capable of giving a winning performance. If you're guiding them back towards those and maybe analyzing, we didn't quite get what we were looking for here, rather than what tends to happen is a bad loss. We have like a meltdown board meeting, right? Where like everyone's in the lecture theater and we look at all our mistakes,
Yeah,
and coach
totally.
like singles players out
Try and
and
yell and scream a little bit just to let people know we care.
yeah,
And
geez, I
yeah,
got to get them going. And,
yeah,
and that's not just the coach. There's pressure from others, particularly like owners and administrators, to do that, right? Like the message always comes to like, you got to get control of this team, get control of your team. And so even the word control there makes you think in a particular way around, I do need to, I've got to grab control of them and try to wrestle performance out of them. Whereas I think what you would see bear fruit more often than not is actually it's probably works the other way around, where they're smart enough to know that they let one slip and that they weren't up to themselves. If you can guide them back towards,
sure.
their natural levels, take some fear away from them, take some pain away from them, and say, I got you here. I think you'd rapidly get back to a closer to a better performance, and stop that slide from becoming four in a row, right? Like that's where you've really failed, is when you let that one become four.
Talk to me about taking fear away from players. What does that look like?
When a player arrives to you as the coach, they bring all of their skills, all of their energy, all of their love of the game, but they also bring all of their fear. And all of their fear may have come from their parents, from their families, from expectations of people around them, and certainly other coaches who've used fear as a so-called motivator. And so people really, or players arrive in your team probably full of fear. And when they don't reach their potential, or they can't uh, consistently deliver, certain skills, or consistently deliver a game plan, often it's fear that's standing in the way. And being able to take that away from them frees them up to be able to deliver more consistently, and to really make the most of their talents. And I'll give you an example. I coached Canadians at Australian football. So
Yeah.
if you're listening to this in Canada or the United States, and you've stumbled home from the bar at 3 a.m. and you've switched on ESPN or TSN and seen a bunch of crazy Australian guys running around with sleeveless shirts on and shorts in the wintertime,
Yeah.
kicking a ball, like that was my sport. And our guys didn't come to it until they were about 22, 23, after they finished playing U Sports hockey or soccer or basketball or lacrosse.
Sure.
And we had to teach them how to kick. But the problem was, at their club teams, often the Aussies would take the ball and kick the ball because, you can't do the skill properly, so I'm going to do it so that we can win.
Oh, I never thought about it. Yeah, that makes sense.
So they get to the national team and no one wants to kick the ball because they want to give it to someone else, because that's kind of the fear that they've brought with them of, I don't want to make a mistake because making mistakes at this new skill has led to me being yelled at.
Yeah.
And, I coached at club level as well, so I knew that, and I'd seen it many, many times, including within our team. And, so we had to take that fear away from them and say, I want you to take the risk. I want you to take the shot at goal. I want you to, we kind of had to build up some confidence that, in pressure situations, we weren't asking for perfection. We were asking for something that's going to help the team. And that might be just to be able to dribble it along the ground 15 meters out into space. That buys us some time. And so really unpacking that fear with them, and then showing that you believe in that, and then actually accepting mistakes in games and saying, see, I told you, I trusted you. We didn't drag you off the ground and substitute you when you made a kicking error. I want you to keep doing it and keep doing it and keep doing it. And that's when you can really see players make strides, is when you take that away from them and then give them the time to believe that you've actually taken it away and that you're just not saying that.
So I've heard you talk a lot about organizational dynamics. So what you just described, or what you just described, makes sense. It's actionable, right? But I can also see where, when we talk about organizational dynamics, if the coach is on that wavelength, the coach is taking that approach, and they say, hey, Cody, you know what? You missed the kick, but I'm going to put you back in there. I want you to keep trying. I want you to learn from this and get better. But the people that coach is reporting to aren't in line with that. And they're like, hey, how come you're not benching Cody? Cody sucks. Why do you keep putting him out there? How much of that friction do you encounter in your day-to-day work when you're perhaps looking at bottlenecks with teams?
Yeah, it's not just up either, it's across. You think about the size of staffs and the types of things that, often, athletic trainers and strapping, whoever's doing the strapping and whoever's, the strength and conditioning guy, they often have more face time with the players than the coach themselves. And so it really is an organizational dynamic. And it's those messages have got to be consistent. And that's where you're managing your staff comes into play. And that includes owners, general managers. And, I think it's not unlike any other disagreement that occurs in the sporting environment. It's got to be, we can disagree, but we've got to commit at the end of it. And so if we're going to go down this path and we want to take this methodology of trying to take away some fear from these players because we think it's going to unlock something, then it's got to be, everyone's got to commit and be all in on that. And so, I think a lot of the work goes into that cultural element around, things like our vocabulary as an organization, the words that we use, and the culture and how we show up, and right the way through to the receptionist and how he or she greets people in the morning, or the things that we say to each other amongst ourselves, the words that we give to our players to use amongst themselves. Do we open up their goal setting to the rest of the team so that everyone knows that they're working on something, and when they see that in a game situation, they can give them what in hockey you give little slaps on the shin pads, don't you? That's kind of your good job. You go over and
Yeah.
hit your stick off someone's shin pads, and so that's the organizational dynamic that I'm talking about. It's not just kind of like going up, and it's really those cultural elements and how information flows and how vocabulary flows to make sure that it's not just a coach having a one-on-one conversation with a player saying, I'm going to take the fear away from you. But ultimately they go into this huge culture, which has a huge bearing on their behavior and their fear anyway. And the fear just comes back. It can't be that.
As you described that, have you read Bill Walsh's book?
I'm a
The Score Takes
huge
Care.
Bill Walsh disciple, yeah.
Yeah, it just reminds me like when they talk about when he took over the San Francisco 49ers and he rewrote job descriptions for every single person in the building. And it wasn't just, when you mentioned the receptionist, for example, and how they greet people when they come in the building, and just how he didn't just say, hey, your job is to pick up the phone. It was like, this is how you're going to pick up the phone. This is the language you're going to use. And, and obviously we talk about culture, and that's, I believe we're gaining a better understanding of what culture is. That culture is it's action. It's something that's a living, breathing thing. I just want to maybe zero in on vocabulary. How mindful, and again, I mean, you're working with some of the best coaches in the world. Like how mindful or deliberate are they in ensuring that everybody on the staff, and not just the coaching staff, like anybody that's interacting with the players, are aligned in the language they're using, their tone, the vocabulary, etc.
Yeah, it's a big work on piece at the moment, I would say, for everyone. And part of that is just the size of staffs and how they've ballooned out in such a short period of time. I think it's the opening gambit of The Tough Stuff, the book that I wrote in 2021. Tony
Yeah,
Granato's talking to me about, it was him and I think Jacques Cloutier, the only
yeah,
staff members in, I think, '05 or
in
'06.
Colorado, yeah,
And he means that. There were no other staff members. So, you've got, that's less than 20 years ago, that you've got perhaps the best professional hockey team ever iced, uh, with one head coach and then one assistant coach, and that's it. And since then, like if you were to go and look at the Avalanche now, it's not just staff members, it's departments.
yeah,
You've got departments of people, and the departments have their own goals within the organization and success metrics, and there's multiple departments. And so that's the big work on, I think, is the move from just we're the coaching group, and that's relatively small, and we might have ballooned out to like 3 or 4 assistants and a goalkeeper coach and a strength conditioning coach, but we're still the coaching cell. Now you're talking about, that's a coaching department, but you've also got analytics, you've got scouting, you've got strength and conditioning, you've got medical, maybe split from strength or not, and so now you're at like 7 or 8 departments that all need to use the same language and talk to players in a consistent way. And so, yeah, of course that's a work on, because that has a huge bearing on getting the players to game time. And the challenge becomes time, particularly in hockey, where play every 3 days or so
yeah,
in the elite levels. And where's the time to work on that? Whereas other sports are a bit luckier in that they have a week. Rugby, Aussie rules, American football, you've got, sometimes you can have 8, 9, 10 days in between games.
yeah.
And so you've got time to actually maybe have a staff meeting. an all staff meeting, right, and say, hey, we've noticed this, we're trying to move towards this, and this is the impact on the players.
So when I hear you speak, and I've gone back and listened to a lot of interviews that you've done, and one thing that stands out to me is certainly when we talk about the organizational dynamics, it would seem to the picture you paint would seem to reflect more of, say, um, the corporate community, whereas it's not, hey, if we lose, it's the head coach's fault and there was no other influences. We just, the answer is we got to get rid of the head coach, where they, I think most large corporations are set up so it's never one person's, um, full responsibility. That doesn't mean they're not accountable, but it means they recognize that there's, when something goes wrong, it's likely not one thing, it's likely multiple things that they might have to solve for. And I just think of, my wife, he's an executive with a well-known sports apparel company that has origins in Vancouver. And, one of the big things that they have culturally is their review process works both ways. You're not just reviewing your reports, you're reviewing the people that you report to. And it's created a lot of transparency. And I think what that does is it identifies that, you know, maybe the reason we didn't reach a sales quota, or certain KPIs weren't met, maybe there's some bottlenecks up the line a little bit. That, again, doesn't mean we have to get rid of people, but it just means that we've got to address them and solve them, and solve those problems. And so that's long-winded, but I'd just be curious, when you think about gaining alignment amongst an organization, we talk about vocabulary, like, what are some other structural things that can be put in place to ensure that everybody is looking at things through the same lens?
Yeah, it's becoming more and more difficult, and part of that is the ballooning out of the staffs, and the fact that there are so many more people that get influence within the organization, and so that creates its own politics, and it creates
Yeah.
all sorts of things. And so everyone always in football in the UK, they always talk about there'll never be another Alex Ferguson, but the reason there'll never be another Alex Ferguson is because it was like him and two other coaches, and they ran the entire club. And
Yeah.
so the opportunities for disagreements and things to not work out, sure, ultimately fell on one person, but that's now 30 people within the organization that can drastically impact a team's performance. And so I think for coaches in particular, it really comes down to, and what I advise on is, the answer is probably in the interview process. And I understand it's tricky in that, you want the job, and, it's the opportunity for you and your family, and it might be money that you'd never even thought of or thought you were capable of, or a stage that you never thought you could get onto. But the same conversations have got to be had around, what's this going to look like when we've lost 4 on the trot? Am I going to be getting angry text messages from you as the owner, you
Yeah.
as the GM at 1 a.m., which isn't going to help me? Are you going to be around, or are you just going to disappear? That's a well-known one, right? The owner just starts to disappear.
Yeah.
So it's like, do you own the team for all of it, and when we're going through all of the different ups and downs, or just when we're winning? And unfortunately, those things have to happen early on, because otherwise we just do the first date fallacy, right? Everyone's on their best behavior. Everyone's telling their best stories.
Yeah.
Here's all the great work that I've done in the past. And you've got a great
Yeah.
organization. It's got a great history. We should date.
Yeah.
And no one tells the truth. And then that
Yeah.
wears off really quickly. And we don't have the conversations about the things that are actually going to be difficult. And the reality of this is, we're trying to do things that are really difficult inherently, and we're trying to do things that often people or teams have never done before. And unless we have conversations about the nature of those difficult things, then we're just going to be making it up as we go. And I think we've got enough evidence that when we make it up as we go, it doesn't go well.
We've worked with a gentleman named Ryan Blank. Ryan works with several coaching staffs and management staffs in the NFL. And he's also told me that he, just for friends and stuff, he's officiated some weddings and he goes through this process. But before he does that, I think similarly, you know, they kind of get the why do we like each other part out of the way, and then he starts asking them questions of what are we going to do when this happens, and kind of goes through maybe some of the. And for anybody that's been married, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. It doesn't mean it's not great, but it's not I guess a linear relationship. And how important, I guess, from an owner to coach, but I would think as a coach, like how important is it for a coach to sit down with his players and saying, hey, like, here's what we're going to do to achieve peak performance, but at the same time, here's how we're going to, when we face adversity. And I think if you've coached long enough, you can probably identify some specific examples. But when these things happen, here's how we're going to tackle these issues as well collectively. How important is that conversation?
Yeah, it's mandatory as far as I'm concerned. And again, I think you can. It's a little bit of a different conversation. I don't think I would perhaps be as blunt with the players.
Yeah.
But I think one interesting thing that I've helped some coaches with is just a little bit of like a guided imagery through seasons, and you can ask them to envision certain things. Like have you ever seen a last place team beat a first place team in a regular season? And give me some examples. Everyone's seen it, and so what makes us think that that's not going to happen to us, or what can we do to prevent that, or what happens if we're in that situation? What happens if we're in that situation on the good side, we're the last ranked team, we beat the top ranked, and what happens if we're the top team? And one example, if you want to use that one, I think, is if you look at the 72 game Chicago Bulls, the 71 game, I forget how many they won. I know Golden State passed them, but I think they lost to the two worst teams in the league that year.
They lost to the Raptors, yeah.
They lost to the Raptors and the Hornets. I think the Hornets were last, and so maybe it was the bottom two teams. And so everyone thinks, great teams are ruthless and they step on the throats of all their competitors. We make these grand statements, and then you look at, again, maybe one of the best teams ever in any sport.
Yeah,
and they,
totally.
And they didn't, and various reasons for that. But, again, I think there's a way to kind of skillfully navigate a team through those things. Okay, have you seen great teams lose 4 games in a row? Yeah, I have. Give me some examples, and let's talk about that. Well, what if that happens to us? What are we going to do? Are we going to train harder? Do you want me to flog you? Do you want to just skate laps? Like what do you think the response is? How are we going to start talking to each other when these things happen? And these don't need to be these huge 8-hour sit-in conferences. Let's solve all the world's problems. But you can get through a decent chunk of those to really set the scene. And obviously you can do positive examples as well.
For sure.
But now the players have identified, back to you, situations that they've seen that they might encounter, and they've already started to think through how they might want to respond. And it gives you an extra lever when that happens during the season. And it's been player involved, not just you thinking it through.
So you mentioned Tony Granato back in the day when there was only 2 coaches on a bench. Well, it wasn't that long before that where there was only 1 coach on a bench. So, the role has changed. I would say the toolbox or the required tools in your toolbox has changed considerably. Where does the ability to ask the right questions, particularly to your players, and listen, rank in terms of the tools that you want in that toolbox, or that coaches today need?
I think it's number one, frankly. Yeah. I mean, again, just to zoom out a little bit, I think it's really a life skill that is probably number one. And we can always kind of go into the academia of it, and everyone goes and studies the best questions, and there's podcasts on it and all that kind of thing. But I don't think you need that to prove that it's useful in life as a craft skill, to be able to craft good questions or ask questions in a timely manner and then actually listen to the responses. And so, but on top of that, I would say that it's been a useful coaching evolution. And, we really are talking about a toolbox here. And so I think people rush to say, maybe a more coach directed coaching style is like out these days, but it is a useful tool to have in the toolbox, right? That's got to be on there, because coaching is a pendulum. There's no right or wrong way. You can do it a bunch of different ways, and so it's still useful to be in there. And that the reason that worked in the kind of quote unquote old days is because one, a lot of the coaches came out of the military. Two, a lot of the players came out of the military, and there was a culture of that's actually what was wanted at that time. And that has evolved out of that situation to a more involved playing group now, who want to be involved in their own learning and want to understand more and don't want to just take direction. And so that's really where I think the evolution becomes really impactful, is being able to not just ask good questions. I think that's a really surface level thing that gets focused on, is you've got to know when to ask that thing, or when to say that thing, or when to intervene, or when to we had this conundrum come up during last week in England, because we because we had because we've decided that all questions are good and all coaching instructions are bad.
Yeah.
The coaches had just merged the two, and they were making a statement in a question. They just reformulated it as a question, and were shouting that question to the players on the field.
Yeah.
But that's not skillful craft. Skillful craft is when I've got something to say, I say it. And when I've got a question to ask, I ask the question. And I think that's a thing that I think coaches have done to ourselves, in that because we've decided that all questions are good always, that we just start to make statements wrapped as a question, and it becomes more confusing. And so,
oh man, so I feel like that answer just added like 2 hours to this conversation.
do a whole session on that.
Well, what I was gonna ask next was, and I think you've got a young son as well, correct?
A 2-year-old, yeah.
Okay, so I've got a 5-year-old, and so when we talk about asking questions, so again, I've heard this from coaches. I get to have these conversations on a daily basis that and if sometimes a way to help people land in the right spot is to ask them questions and allow them to effectively lead themselves there. So this morning with my little guy, we're talking about cleaning up, and so I have this. Sometimes you get emotional in the moment, and you're like, clean up your toys. Very aggressive, and that's how you get your point across. And then I'll have these moments where I'm like, no, like reframe it in the form of a question. So it's like, hey, would you rather do it now, or would you rather do it after home when your pals are going to be out on the street playing, that type of thing. And I think about that in the sense of, like, to me, that's coaching. It's can you take the emotion out of it in the moment and allow yourself to clearly look in your toolbox and say, what's the most effective strategy in this case? And that might be being really direct. It might be asking a question. I don't think it's ever black and white. I think that's the art of coaching, is to be able to, but I think the key part is, can you emotionally take yourself out of it and access all of your tools, and not, I think we all have, as human beings, we all have tools that are just our default, that we use when we're under stress, or we're angry, or we're down, whatever. So that's part of the reason I asked. But I think when you talk about the coaches trying to take these two things and create a black and white scenario, I think of, like, I'm like a lot of people. I love Ted Lasso. I think there's so many great lessons there. I think there's so many great anecdotes there in that show. But I can also see how easily people are like, oh, well, that becomes the coaching manual, and then everybody tries to be Ted Lasso. And I'm like, the reason Ted Lasso is unique because he was himself. Like, that was the lesson there. and it doesn't mean that, that's not a Bible, so to speak. That's so I just, anyways, I'd be curious when you're looking at these, you know, what are hard and fast lessons, and or I guess what part of your role is saying, like, here's the hard and fast lessons are what we always do, and here's the part where it's a craft. You've got to adopt things that work for you, and be mindful that you can't, at the end of the day, the one thing you can't be is you can't be somebody else. You got to be yourself.
Yeah, I'm a fan of coaching as a craft. We like to argue whether it's an art or a science, but I think it's a craft. And what a craft relies on in any discipline, whether it's making cabinets or belts or
Yeah.
coaching, is it's really about how the craft person constructs the world, and the work becomes an embodiment of that. And I really like that idea, in that it does really depend on how the coach is constructing the world, how they think about teamwork, how they think about instruction versus questioning, how they think about the challenges that they're facing, and uh, the role within the larger organization, or the expectations from the organization, because all of those things are important. Manchester United don't have the same expectations as Burnley.
Yeah.
If like Jose Mourinho is the old Manchester United coach.
Yeah.
He talked about being happy that they'd won the Charity Shield, but they don't put statues of you out the front of Old Trafford for winning the Community Shield now, right? But if you did that at Burnley, there'd be a statue out the front of the of the ground for you. And so even that impacts how you think about coaching. And that's the same whether you're here with the Toronto Marlies junior program. There's a different thing that will impact. Anyway, all that is to say, it's really how you're constructing the world and your role in it that becomes how you use your toolbox and your craft, and where the team's at in their maturity levels. And yeah, I think a good lesson from Ted Lasso was that he didn't really deviate from being himself, even through the midst of. It's actually a story about his deep trauma from his from his
Yeah.
marriage breaking down. By the way, it's not about anything else. That's the consistent theme through all of it. But
Yeah.
through that, he managed to, in front of the players, remain himself. And but yeah, we need to be cautious of also looking at that as some sort of Bible, because I tell you, Premier League players don't really respond that way.
And I think, like I said, it made for great TV. But I looked at that and I'm like, oh man, like that's and again, I think it's like anything else. That's part of the craft, is being able to identify things that you want to borrow or steal from. It could be from other coaches, pop culture, like anything. I mean, I think good coaches do that. They're always very observant, and
All craftspeople are, right. Like
yeah,
you talk about music, the arts, anything with your hands, anything that we also think of as a craft is the stealing of ideas from others, or the influence of ideas from others is inherent in that. And so we do need to keep that in coaching as well, whilst also being on this, as Pete Carroll says, this journey to discover who you are. And understanding that you're on that journey, and you're going to be at various points in that journey as you're younger, and it's easier to know who you are when you're 70 and have won a Super Bowl. But when you're 35 and still trying to figure out what the game is about, and who you are as a parent, now there's a lot of cloudiness. And so just giving yourself some grace as you're on that journey, I think, is important too.
One of the things I do in advance of these conversations is I will I'll listen to other interviews. I'll read about the people that join us, and um, you know, a lot of time I'll look for if there's a word or a couple of words that get repeated a lot, and maybe root down. And one of the words that I've heard you mention a lot is the role of a coach is it's you're directing a performance, and performance was like a really consistent word. And I wish I could connect the dots on the rabbit hole that I went down. But I thought about um, a conductor, and from a I'm not musically inclined, um, but I've always been, the ignorant version of me would look at an orchestra and say they all have sheets of music in front of them, like they have the playbook in front of them.
That's right.
Why do they need a guy with a stick and that's all he's communicating with is a stick, getting them in line? So I just did advance that. I'm like, you know what? I'm gonna do some research into what a conductor is, and this was the dictionary's definition, and it was the primary responsibilities of the conductor are to unify performers, set the tempo, execute clear preparations and beats, listen critically, and shape the sound of the ensemble, and control the interpretation of pacing the music. And I read that and I'm like, man, you could replace a few words there, and you probably have the at least what I would consider the perfect definition of what a head coach's role is.
I
That it's
couldn't
not
agree
about
more.
where you put the cones and what direction you turn around them. It's bringing humans together.
Mm. Yeah, and to go a step further, you know, and I've just come from, again, an immersive learning environment for coaches doing this exact thing, working on their game craft. And that's one of the things that gets forgotten, particularly in the development space, player development. And it kind of becomes individualized, and there's this idea that the individual is going to go on, and so you pour individual skill into players. But really, a coach's role still, even in development environment, is to, even if you've got an elite player, help them understand how to play on a team or on teams, teams of different capabilities perhaps as well. And it's not just about how many sticks they can stick handle under, in a nice looking little drill that goes on Instagram.
Yeah,
Because I haven't seen that happen in a game yet. I haven't seen 20 pucks all laid out for you to handle around.
yeah.
So there's a lot more to it, and particularly that was the first one that you read there for the conductor, like helping them play together.
And I read that, and it just occurred to me. I'm like, man, the reason there's a conductor is there was probably another ignorant person like me that said we don't need the conductor, and they tried that, and it didn't work out very well. And people said, you know what, we need the conductor here, even though we all have the music, even though we're all expert players, we still need. There's a benefit in performance to having somebody there unifying us.
Yeah, and I would say it's so spot on, and it's actually a really interesting thought experiment that you can do with your players as well, is to ask them why they have a coach.
Yeah,
It's not in the kind of the rules of most of our sports. Leagues may differ, but in like the foundational rules of hockey and football and all these things, a coach isn't in there. It's not a mandatory. Like, a team can rock up and play in most sports without a coach. And so if that's the case, then you can ask them, why do you have one? And most won't be able to answer it outside of, because we've always had one, and every team, other teams have them. But it's deeper than that. It really is about what you're talking about there. There's things like learning to play together and making difficult decisions, picking the team, um, helping them achieve their goals, being an accountability partner, the tempo of the season, the tempo of the game, the line changes, there's a multitude of things. But unpacking that with your team, I think, would be a really interesting thought experiment to see what they think you do, and why they think that might be important. And you might actually uncover some things that you're not doing that they might want you to do.
um, I'm just curious. Any other experiments that you've conducted over the course, whether it's as a coach or in your role as a coach of coaches, that maybe have provided some unique insights into how teams and how they operate?
Could do a whole thing on experiments.
Yeah.
I didn't expect to have them racked up and ready to go. But another one would
No,
be,
that's fair.
but as you, I think going back to that organizational dynamics piece, and this doesn't need to be. This can just be like a team dynamic thing, and just in a small community operation, you still probably have 5, 6, 10, 12 parents doing different roles. And I think it's still important to do something similar to what we just described there in terms of identifying who thinks who's doing what, and like, what do you think the team manager does, and really outlining and getting some role clarity there, I think would be really important for most, because that seems to be, as I've traveled around the world and spoken to community groups, Olympic sports, which isn't really my thing, and team sports and all sorts of levels.
Invasion sports. I've heard you talk about invasion sports, and I was like, and I had to look. I'm like, what's an invasion sport? And I
Yeah,
think I got to the bottom, but I hadn't really
your
heard that
sport's an
before.
invasion sport.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, yeah. For anyone that doesn't know, there's a group of sports called invasion sports where the key idea is to invade the opposition space and score.
yes, yeah,
Um, and those all have remarkable similarities in how they try to address those problems. But the team around the team and understanding and getting role clarity and really clear, I think, is a missed piece right now at all levels in all sports. It's a consistent thing that I get asked about. And
yeah,
so we haven't found a way to navigate that. And I think it just starts with assumptions, that we assume that the team manager is going to do all these things and the coach is going to do all these things. Whereas I think if we can sit down and really understand the responsibilities and appetite to do certain things, I think we're in a better place. Because at the moment, what's happening is we're getting in the way, we're beating ourselves before we even get on the ice or on the field.
yeah,
And the team around the team shouldn't beat the team that's about to go out there and play. The whole idea is that you're giving them every opportunity to go out there and not have to worry about anything and just be able to play the game. And I don't see that in many organizations. We're at least partially beating ourselves before they've even stepped out on the ice. And that can't be the case.
That's really well said. And one of the reasons I asked about the experimentation is that, and I'm kind of going through this in real time right now. So we just launched at the coaches site this new platform, and our previous way of communicating or hosting our content was we had an out of the box website. So you kind of had the framework constraints and you made it work. And then we decided to build something from scratch. Took us 2.5 years. And now we're on this journey where we realize like we're just constantly, we can kind of do whatever we want. We can make the button blue, we can make it green, it can be a square, it can be a circle. Like there's a user experience. And so what we've gone into this rhythm of is we're constantly experimenting. And we do an experiment, we identify what would be how would we measure it, and then we do it, we get feedback, we make a decision, and we move on to the next thing. And I what have observed with coaches and organizations is that I think particularly with coaches, because the season's long, we all hear about the message getting stale. Well, if we don't give coaches the space to experiment, to try things, and accept that some of those experiments aren't going to work out that well, but at least we're going to learn that sometimes when things don't work, it's just getting us closer to the truth or what's right. And I think so much of what I hear in talking with coaches when they're being really candid is that, just mistakes aren't tolerated. So I'm just going to stick with what I think works, or at least what I can defend. That if things don't work, I can say, well, I did it this way and this is the way it's always been done. So it's not my fault. It's the player's fault, or it just provides that bridge to pass the buck, so to speak. So, and I think what I thought was going to be a tipping point, certainly for hockey coaches, was when the Tampa Bay Lightning finished first overall in the league and got swept in 4 games by the Columbus Blue Jackets, the 8th seed in the 2019 playoffs. And conventional wisdom was that John Cooper and his staff should have been fired immediately. but Jeff Finnick, the owner of the Lightning, I'm paraphrasing here, but basically said, "Yeah, we're going to look at this as an organization. Like, what could the organization have done better?" The Lightning win the next two Stanley Cups. So conventional wisdom in that case is like, well, we should give coaches the benefit of the doubt. But you post stats on Twitter all the time, and we see it in hockey and professional sports where we still, kick people to the curb as soon as we get one result that we don't feel is best represents our team.
Yeah. Yeah. The reason that you're seeing coaching in the state that it's in is, we talked about fear earlier, and whilst coaches are certainly in the news recently for creating fear cultures, it must be acknowledged that they also operate within a fear culture. And
That's so,
so,
yeah, so true. Yeah.
and so the reason that you're seeing a lot of the behavior that you see is because they are in a fear culture themselves. And, there was research done by the English Institute of Sport that found that 70% of our behavior is linked to our environment. And so this is where I think it's kind of interesting in that if you go along that line of thinking and a coach's resilience and their mental skills and their ability to deal with pressure still only accounts for 30% of their ability to um, demonstrate perhaps positive behaviors through adversity. And if 70% of that comes from their environment, and their environment is toxic, or their environment doesn't allow for failure, or their environment doesn't, would sack John Cooper, then you're never going to be able to overcome that 70% with your 30%. And so
Yeah.
that's the battle that we're up against now. And this is across the board. The NCAA football average tenure is at an all-time low. The championship in England in soccer, the second tier, it's below 1 year, the average tenure.
Isn't that just mind-boggling?
Yeah, yeah. And there's a fear culture around the money that's involved, and if I can just replace you, and so what sort of behaviors would you expect? What sort of coaching would you expect from anyone that you put into that environment where you might have 6 months? And I'll tell you what I would do is I would want all my own people. I wouldn't be listening to anyone outside of my inner circle. I would do the things that
Yeah.
coaches are getting slammed for, because you've put me in this environment. Whereas if you put me in the Tampa Bay Lightning environment where you're encouraged to take risks, and we have a number one seed that loses and we get to stay on, and we make sure that we learn through that process, as opposed to going, showing up and saying, oh, nah, nothing we did could have prevented that. Or, you start to create an environment where people can thrive. And this is the thing. We know this because this is what we're trying to create for our players. We're arguing about it, that our players have to be in this
100%.
environment.
100%. Yeah.
So then so what you're saying is people need to be in that environment, not hockey players, not football players, not Aussie rules players. People need to be in a supportive environment that allow them to pursue their goals, allow them to pursue mastery, to have autonomy, to have a sense of belonging. Self-determination theory at its core. We don't offer that to our coaches, and so we are seeing their responses to a fear-based culture, and it is fearful behavior, which is what you would expect.
Yeah. And when it comes, like, when you're having conversations one-on-one with head coaches, how much of it is maybe the challenges they face is just rooted in the pressure? And I think, gosh, I mean, I think whether you're the average fan, like, people just assume, it's easy to assume, well, so-and-so is a head coach and they're making lots of money, so this is, they don't deal with pressure like the rest of us human beings. They're just, they obviously, it rolls off their back. And we did an event earlier this year with Bruce Cassidy of the Vegas Golden Knights. And I remember asking him, I'm like, there's an audience, and the audience in that particular thing just happened to be a lot of sort of business and tech executives, and I said, how many of you have had, a bad day at work? A lot of hands go up, and because we can all relate to that. And I said, when I have a bad day, what gets me through it is I think about the coaches that we work with, and I'm like, gosh, well, at least my bad day isn't on the front page of the paper or isn't being dissected on sports talk radio. Like, at least I get to deal with my shit in a vacuum. And I don't have to have my kids read about it or my wife or family, etc. So I just be curious, like, one, how much of that pressure do people divulge to coaches say, actually, this is really tough to deal with? And at the same time, how do you help them manage that stress?
Yeah, a lot of my relationships start maybe off the back of that,
Yeah,
line
I
of
bet they
thinking,
do.
particular situation within the season, or things aren't going to plan, and coaches often isolate themselves, because I understand the money thing at the professional level, but also they're human beings with pride and expectations, and a want to do well. And when you feel like you can't even go down to your local coffee shop and get a coffee because you've disappointed people, I'm sorry, that's a different thing from you made a mistake in the accounts payable department of a company. And I live in Toronto, as you know, Aaron, and to your point, it's a different ball game when the performance of your team is literally how the city feels about itself on any given day. Again, that is a different conundrum than you had a bad day in the marketing department. And so, and that's not lost on coaches. They are fully aware of, how much the city often is is wanting them to do well, and that's a double-edged sword. It's the greatest thing in the world, but also the most challenging to navigate. And so,
Well, so yeah, in funny example. So the first interview when I started the coaches site, the first interview I ever did was Sheldon Keefe. And at the time, he was the owner, the head coach, GM. Pretty sure he sold the hot dogs and drove the Zamboni as well for the Pembroke Lumber Kings of the Central Canadian Junior A Hockey League. Just retired and bought this team. And I bring that up where you look at the stage he's on now, and I'm sure that Sheldon, if he was a part of this conversation, would say, "Gosh, like tactically, I'm so much better, and this is how I got better. I talked to people, I had these conversations, I read books, etc." But you look at all that, and I think that's one thing that maybe coaches aren't prepared for. There's not really formal training to say, "Hey, gosh, it's going to be a lot, coach. The pressure you're going to face coaching the Pembroke Lumber Kings or the Sioux Greyhounds or the Toronto Marlboros versus the Toronto Maple Leafs, like it is, it's apples and oranges." And I'd just be curious too, like my sense is for a lot of maybe the culture of sport is that it's probably not okay for anybody to put their hand up and say, "Hey, I don't know if I'm prepared for this. I might need some help. I might need some coaching on how to deal with some of the stuff that I haven't gone through before, but I sense I'm about to." And is that part of the role that you play?
that's exactly the role that I play. Yeah,
Yeah.
my I call my world coaching performance, and that's really what it is looking at the coach as a performer. And that includes the pressure, and what are the skills that are missing. They're not often taught at coaching licenses and things as needed, because it's mostly tech and tack. Um, and so yeah, and you don't know how you're going to react to it. I would throw Jim Montgomery into that conversation and say, um, when you're someone like him, and I think it was 8 years between him coaching junior and the Stars, and the rapid ascent of that, I think probably accounts for what happens to him, or his inability to navigate through that. And again, I don't know him, I don't know the intricate details of it, but I would kind of look at that and say, I can probably piece together a coach that, wasn't really prepared for what it was going to do to him. And what I'm talking about here isn't skills necessarily, but it's It's this idea of a lot of coaches can't sleep, for instance.
You know what?
And
That
so,
so obvious, right? But yeah, like, and we know that how that affects performance. Yeah,
whether it's because you're on the bus from the Soo to Sudbury, or whether it's you're
yeah,
on a flight, or whether it's you're just in a quiet hotel room, kind of stewing on the performance or the training session, and you can see how it very quickly becomes one thing that I know helps me get to sleep is a glass of wine, and all of a sudden that becomes four, and all of a sudden that becomes, a slippery slope. And so, uh, I mean, those things are, I think, a lot more common than people think, and it all kind of comes down to this idea of we're not really preparing coaches to be head coaches. What we're preparing them to be is very good assistant coaches, and then hoping that they figure out the rest on the job.
yeah. And I sort of liken it to, if I laid out a 2x4 a foot off the ground, I know I could walk across it no problem. If I put it 100 feet in the air, I'd be scared shitless, and I would probably either not step foot on it or I'd fall off. Um, and I think a lot of that, we lose that, and that there's maybe a mental, the physical act is the same, how it gets processed mentally, and how we speak to ourselves, the language we use, the process we might go through to prepare for that physical action is I would assume quite different. And I would think a great example with, again, Jim's another one. Remember chatting with him when he was with Dubuque in the USHL. And then it was just like, again, like you said, snap your fingers. He's like, oh, he's head coach of the Dallas Stars now. And we forget the human aspect of that. How, you're a great listener. Um, how much of your role, how much of the effectiveness of your role is just purely based on the fact, because as much as I think being a head coach, and I've heard this a lot of like CEOs say this, that CEOs say like the reason they have these like CEO forums and these networking groups is just a lot of it's just so they have people to talk to, because perhaps their spouses don't really relate to what they're going through. Their direct reports, their right hands, they might feel really uncomfortable saying that they're struggling with things or they don't have all the answers. And so that becomes valuable. How much of the value that you bring to the table is that you provide just an outlet for coaches to express and share things that otherwise they might have to bottle up?
Yeah, again, I think it's crucial. And also, often where my relationship with coaches would start would be that they're dealing with something in particular, and often they need to get it out. And so, I'm not a therapist. I'm not here to sit here and just endlessly listen. We're
Yeah.
going to have to take action at some point against their goals, and so there's a whole process behind that. But yeah, quite often, and I I'm lucky in that I only work with maybe a dozen coaches or so, and so some will just call me to talk. It doesn't need set sessions and things. I'll just call out of the blue and say, I just need to get this off my chest. Or it could be, I just want to practice what I'm going to say tomorrow to this player or to the team, or it's all
Yeah.
sorts of things. But often it's just that they have nowhere to go, and they don't want to talk to someone who's going to listen judgmentally. And that's where
Yeah.
I think me being a national team head coach, who's maybe not been at the same level as them necessarily, but understands what they're going through, and will just sit there and go, yeah, sounds about right.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think just to make a distinction, I mean, I think you've been really clear that you're not I think you put it, you're not like a well-being expert or well-being coach, that you're there to enhance performance. Like ultimately that's the role, is to help the coach drive better performance from the team. But I mean, it's, just as you said, like you bring up, um, for the ability for a coach to take you through what they might say, how they're going to address the team, how to address a particular player. I mean, gosh, I mean, as we've moved along, I have to do a lot more public speaking, or we do these, videos of the coaches site. Like, I'm not suggesting I'm great at it by any means, but I do know this, like I make our staff watch me on, like, I tested out multiple times, get a ton of feedback. And I often think, like, if I couldn't go to them and get their feedback beforehand, like, again, I might not be great now, but I know it'd be not very good if I didn't have that outlet to go and test out the material first, and have people I trust to give me their honest opinion.
Yeah, we quickly forget that leaders don't have it all figured out and aren't perfect and need to continue to develop, and so they've been left alone. And coaches, unfortunately, have been swept up in that, and often need someone to go to and have an empathetic ear, but also help them navigate through that. And I think that's the crucial part, is that my expertise is in coaching. I somehow ended up with this well-being label because I wrote a book about emotion. But like you said, I'm not a well-being expert, and frankly, I'm not particularly interested in it. What I'm interested in is well-being as a mechanism to help us perform as people and start to push towards our true potential. And I believe it is one of the core pillars of that. And so, but yeah, my whole thing is in coaching performance, and we're leaving a lot on the table. And
Yeah.
that's the exciting thing, is we're actually doing a really good job as a community, given what we're working with and the conditions that we're put under. We're doing some amazing things. And to think of what's possible if we start to think of ourselves as
Yeah.
performers and get into healthy and high performing environments ourselves, there's this whole level of coaching expertise that can get unlocked if we can start to push towards that. And that's what I'm most excited about.
So on that note, you posted recently an article, I think it was in The Economist, on Jurgen Klopp, who's a German professional footballer or soccer coach. Um, I believe he works with Liverpool now, but he talks about energy. And gosh, I think one of the most impressive things that I've come to observe, like, I mean, if I get home from a flight from Toronto, the last thing I feel like, I'm exhausted, from a trip. And then I put myself in the shoes of these, whether it's athletes or coaches, the amount of travel, the grind that is a season, the fact that they can show up every day like that in itself is that's a muscle that's been worked time after time. That's a skill, I think, to show up with energy. And I'd just be curious to know, how important is that energy, or how can, you know, again, because some coaches are getting off a plane from Toronto, some are racing to the rink from a 9 to 5 job that's probably equally stressful as well, and they got to show up in front of a group of 10-year-olds. What advice might you give, just in terms of how to both preserve, and then ensure that you show up with energy? Because I think my favorite quote is that, teams become their leader, and so if the leader doesn't have energy, it's probably unrealistic to expect that the team is.
Yeah, yeah, and you can go even further than that. Is they've done research on what teams think of coaches that are burnt out and stressed, and they view you as less competent.
Yeah.
And so, one, they know whether you think you've hidden it well or not. It's kind of like when you when you
Yeah.
used
So
to
no.
when you'd go to the party and try to convince your mum that you hadn't had a drink when you were 15 or whatever, and it's
Yeah.
like she knew. And it's the
Yeah.
same with your players. But um, yeah, I mean, I think they don't need to be these big grand things. I think it's really about being able to manipulate your energy, and one of those is like small little exercises that you can do. So breathing is a good one. Napping is a superpower. And these are things that aren't traditionally thought of, but that could be the difference for a community coach. Even in the car, sitting in the rink or whatever, is like a 10-minute nap can be the difference between you being able to walk into the rink and show up, closer to your best self. And so, yeah, everyone's busy. I think there's still small things that we can do. There are a lot of bigger things, structural things, operational things that we can do to find areas that don't drain our energy and don't drain our attentional capacity. which is really the knock-on effect. Is you stop being able to pay attention to the things that you need to engage in good coaching. And so, that's why we do need to preserve our energy. Or, for Jurgen Klopp, it's over, dozens of years that he's run out of energy. But, again, there are small things that we can do to be able to manipulate our energy to show up better in the rink. But then there's a larger structural things that we can do to make sure that, the cognitive load placed on the head coach in particular, given they're the authority figure and the one that everyone's following, so that they can maybe get a bit of a leg up.
Yeah. There's a quote from your most recent, I believe this is from your most recent book. And maybe you can clarify that. But the quote is, to have coachability, you need coachability. Rather than asking whether every player is coachable, perhaps we should ask whether we have the strength of identity to be able to coach different types of players. Can you elaborate on that, specifically what you mean by strength of identity?
Yeah, well, this idea of the current manifestation of a coachable player suggests that there's one way and it's your way, and that's a singular identity from the coach.
Got it. Yeah.
The strength of identity, or strength of character even, would suggest that if that way didn't work, I've got other ways that I can try to help this player. And so, I think that's what I'm getting at with that idea, is that the coach's responsibility is to have multiple ways of coaching the same thing for a variety of players and a variety of situations and a variety of journeys that player might be on through their own maturation process. This idea that if you can't do it my way, then you can't play, is really an abdication of the responsibility of coaching. And so the splitting apart of the word coachability is coach ability. So the coach needs to have ability. And what that says to me is that it goes back to this toolbox idea of you need to have a lot of tools in there to be able to navigate different types of players and where they're at, rather than this rash judgment that because they can't or don't want to do it the one way that you want it done, that they can't play, or they're not a team player, or they're not coachable. I don't agree with that at all.
Got it. Yeah, which it's maybe another observation, and I think that sort of dwells in or is connected. Is I've noticed that a lot of great coaches, they're really in tune with pop culture. Like, they're interested in music, they're interested in a lot of things, and what I sense is that they use those lessons to provide examples, frameworks, analogies, etc. So they're kind of armed with a bunch of different ways to help people connect to a message. But if they're closed-minded, or at least I would say that is, call it the new age coach. That's an observation I made, that they're very much, they don't live with blinders on where it's only about hockey or football or whatever. They've got maybe a wider lens, and they use that information to help better communicate their message. So one thing you're better at than I am, Cody, is pronouncing the names of some prominent European football coaches. So one is Pep. Help me out here. Pep Guardiola. Yeah.
Guardiola. Yep.
There you go. So, and I think I'm not a rabid football fan, but my understanding, I mean, as of today, he would be arguably the top manager in football. Is that fair?
Yeah, undoubtedly. Yeah.
And he has had a coach himself throughout his entire professional career. And, I can appreciate why that's valuable. I think anybody listening to this conversation can appreciate why that's valuable. You mentioned you work with 12 coaches a year, or you might work with 12 coaches at one time. For all the coaches listening that might say, gosh, I'm not in a position, or maybe I'm not coaching at a level where it makes sense to pick up the phone and hire Cody. Do you have any other examples of maybe any ways that coaches can access coaching themselves? Like, does it always have to be sort of a formal type relationship, or any recommendations on how they might seek some outside guidance?
No, there's all sorts of ways to, build something around yourself. I think having someone consistent is certainly the best, in that you don't need to reintroduce yourself, or as you work with someone through goals and years, they get an understanding of you. Just like it's best for probably players to have a consistent coach, um, as well, in that they get to know each other and what you expect, etc., etc. But yeah, I mean, one would be within high schools in particular and colleges, is there are so many coaches around you
Other sports, yeah.
that can other sports, or it could be the other coaching the other gender, for instance. So you can help each other there in a less formal environment. There's just engaging someone from a different sport that you know, particularly I would say within the invasion sports. And if you don't know what those are, you can look them up. And the reason I say that is there's just nuances to what we do in team sports that don't exist in more individual pursuits. Um, there's also kind of a bit of some coaches have a board of directors approach, where they actually have 5 different people that they can call to kind of coach them on different things at different times. And so it divvies up the responsibility amongst those coaches, and you're not asking for huge amounts of time. And often people will give you, an hour every couple of months to have a chat and help you out with things. So there's all sorts of ways that you can divide it up. It doesn't need to be hiring me, and my slate's full anyway. But there's also a lot of coaches that are now coming out of their careers, who are starting to work directly with coaches. And so you're going to see more and more coaches open up to that possibility, because the reality is all I do is coach, just like I coached athletes previously. Now I just coach coaches. And so it's not too dissimilar. And so, I think one of the reasons for writing Second Set of Eyes was to start to build a workforce and prove to people that it's possible to have this be part of the coaching pathway, and not just finish up coaching the team and then I'm done forever, and I take all my coaching knowledge and resources with me. So
Yeah, and it's funny. Like, I know, just talking with coaches, whether they've retired, but more generally they've been fired. Is ask them, like,
sure.
how's it going? They're like, I'm busier than ever. Like, my phone's ringing off the hook, because as soon as they're let go, people want to bounce ideas off them and pick their brain. And I also remind everybody that Tony Soprano, well, running as a mob boss, had Jennifer Melfi as somebody he could talk to all the time as his therapist. So everybody and everyone, it just helps to have some coaching, or somebody providing that, as you said, that second set of eyes. I want to talk about TCS Live, our conference, Cody, where we're so fortunate that you're going to take time and come and speak to our audience. But before I do, this was actually the first question I wanted to ask you, and I just want to squeeze it in before we go. But if you had to write a job description for a coach, a professional coach, and you only had 3 sentences to work with, how would you write that job description?
Well, you've asked that to a writer, and so it might take me a little bit of time to workshop it in my mind. But
maybe the key attribute, maybe not sentences. What would be the 1 or maybe 2 key attributes that you'd say, like, that you need to possess these skills or these traits?
Coaching, my definition of coaching is the consistent search for ongoing solutions. So you want coaches to be solution oriented and interested in both problems and solutions. And I'd also be looking for a coach who thinks of themselves as a performer and is interested in the performance of coaching, because I think that's the key to the longevity of it. And this kind of workaholism idea, I think, has reached its end. And we're now looking for coaches that are, again, interested in the performance of it. And it is very taxing. And if you think that that's the best way to do it, to help change the behavior of young men and women from a place of complete depletion because you've been up watching film all night, I'm not interested in hiring that kind of coach.
Yeah.
And then I would add probably open-minded to that. It's probably linked to the first thing, the search for solutions. But I'm really interested in coaches that are bringing, to your point earlier, Aaron, like interests in other things, music and because coaching is an exchange of humanity, and
Yeah.
when you're interested in all sorts of different things that humanity engages in, ideas come to you from those other interests, and they can impact your coaching. And so, I'd be interested in hobbies, other interests outside of a sport, because I think those really have a knock-on effect.
Man, you know what? I really appreciate this conversation, Cody, but I'm so happy you just said what you said. And while I'm not a coach of coaches, I have a lot of conversations, and I just watch so many coaches, many of whom are really good friends of mine. And their solution to everything is grind harder, watch more film. And I just, from an outsider's perspective, I just see where that sort of default approach just, again, not convinced it helps their teams perform better, but it certainly doesn't support healthy relationships, be it with their spouses, family, kids, etc. And ultimately, those are going to affect how you show up with your team, I believe anyway. So I really appreciate that you said that. As I mentioned, Cody, you're going to be joining us at TCS Live. I know we haven't dove in deep on a specific topic, but what might be some of the things that you'll touch on, or things or takeaways that you can offer coaches that are going to be in attendance?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely going to be a lot of the themes that you've heard today, but certainly the coaching performance and what that is, and really how to start to think about yourself. And more importantly, is why that's important. And, I've been fortunate in writing a book about, well, I guess two books now about kind of this coaching performance idea, is that I have all the data and all the studies. And so I'm going to show you all of those and piece them together as to why you need to take this seriously, because there is a way to move from that more coaching idea, that pure grind, to better coaching, because that's actually where the answers are, is in better coaching.
Love it. Can't wait, man. Thanks so much for joining us today and sharing a little bit about your work. And I know myself and everyone tuning in here is excited to see you on stage at TCS Live.
Can't wait to be down there. Short drive down the road for me. And if anyone listens to this and has a better idea on what I should present on, get in contact with me.
Yeah, well, I would say anybody, if you don't, follow Cody on Twitter, like just as a daily injection of, I would say, positivity or friendly nudges. I can't recommend it enough. And again, the books are The Tough Stuff, Second Set of Eyes. Make sure you check those out in advance from joining us. So again, Cody, thanks so much.
Thanks, mate. It's great to chat to you.